The air that night carried a strange electricity, one that hummed through the streets of Chicago, across the rolling fields of Ohio, through the rusted bridges of Pennsylvania, and over the quiet towns that had forgotten how to dream. The television screens flickered in dimly lit living rooms, blue light washing over faces that had seen too much war, too much division, too many promises broken. But tonight, something different was in the air. It wasn't just hope. It was the sound of history shifting. The cheers began as a murmur, then swelled like a wave crashing over Grant Park. A young man in a threadbare coat lifted his daughter onto his shoulders, her small hands gripping his hair, as the crowd around them trembled with disbelief. "Daddy," she whispered, eyes wide at the giant screens. "Did we win?" He didn't answer right away. His throat was tight, his eyes glistening. Because in that moment, he realized that the word "we" suddenly meant something new, something larger than he'd ever dared to imagine. The map on the screen bled blue state by state: Virginia, Colorado, Ohio, and then California. The numbers locked into place, and a hush fell over millions watching from home and abroad. In that silence, the past seemed to draw a long breath. Then the announcement came, firm and steady like the toll of a bell. Barack Obama has been elected the 44th President of the United States. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Then came the sound, a roar that split the night open. People screamed, cried, clapped, fell to their knees. Strangers embraced in Times Square. A woman in Atlanta clutched the photograph of her grandfather, who had marched in Selma. In Los Angeles, a boy too young to vote stood barefoot on his porch, tears streaking his cheeks, whispering the name over and over, "Obama, Obama." And somewhere in the dark corridors of the White House, lights flickered on, as if the old ghost within its walls stirred to witness what had just occurred. But behind the jubilation was something else, a tremor of disbelief. For this was not just a political victory, it was the bending of a nation's timeline. A century's worth of struggle, doubt, and blood had been building to this precise point, and now it had broken through. The son of a Kenyan father and a Kansas mother, a man who once walked the cracked sidewalks of Chicago's South Side as a community organizer, was now president-elect. Outside, the November air bit cold against faces glistening with tears. The smell of wet pavement mixed with roasted chestnuts from nearby vendors, and the chants of "Yes, we can" rolled through the crowd like thunder. But inside Barack Obama's private room, just moments before stepping onto the stage, the noise faded. He sat alone for a brief moment, his head bowed, the weight of a nation pressing invisibly on his shoulders. The campaign had been brutal. Months of relentless scrutiny, coded hatred, the ghosts of history whispering that this could never happen. Yet here he was. A Secret Service agent nodded to him, the door slightly ajar, and beyond it lay a stage glowing in floodlights, waiting for a man who had just become a symbol. He stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket, his reflection catching the faint gleam of the window beside him. In the distance, Lake Michigan rippled beneath the city's glow. He thought of his grandmother, who had passed away just days before the election, and how she'd always told him that the arc of the moral universe was long, but it bends toward justice. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and whispered something no one could hear. "Let's go." The applause that met him as he emerged was deafening. A sea of faces, young and old, black and white, hopeful and broken, rose to meet him. Behind him, the giant screens shimmered with the words, "Change has come to America." For a fleeting second, time seemed to collapse. 1963 met 2008, the shadow of Martin Luther King Jr. brushing against the light of this new dawn. It was as if the ghosts of Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma stood among the living once again, watching silently from the edges of history. And yet, for all the beauty of the moment, beneath the roar of the crowd lurked an unspoken question. What happens to hope once it becomes power? For 8 long years before that night, America had lived in the shadow of war and fear. The smoldering ruins of 9/11 had hardened hearts, divided neighbors, and painted the future in shades of suspicion. 2 wars raged overseas. The economy teetered on collapse. Families lost homes. Soldiers lost limbs, and trust in government decayed like rusted steel. The promise of unity felt naive, even dangerous. And yet this man, this calm, eloquent man, had dared to say that hope was not foolishness, that unity was not weakness, that words could still mean something. In Iowa cornfields, factory towns, and packed college gyms, his voice had echoed across America. We are not as divided as our politics suggest. But those who opposed him whispered darker things, that he was too different, too untested, too other. The birther lies would come soon enough, festering like a wound. The fear of change, the backlash of progress, the centuries-old reflex to protect the old order. It was all waiting just beyond the edge of that night's light. But none of that mattered yet, not as he stood there, his family by his side, and spoke the words that would define an era. If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, he said, voice trembling with emotion, tonight is your answer. Those words carried across oceans, through radios and TV screens, through cell phones and open windows. In Nairobi, children gathered around a crackling radio, listening as their countryman's name was spoken with reverence. In Berlin, people cheered in bars, saying the world might finally turn a page. And in a small town in Mississippi, an old woman who had once been denied the right to vote sat in her rocking chair, whispering through tears, "I never thought I'd live to see this." But while millions saw deliverance, others saw danger. In the quiet living rooms of those who feared change, the victory looked less like progress and more like a reckoning. The culture wars of decades past began to stir again, this time cloaked in talk of taking the country back. The divisions that Obama had promised to heal were far deeper than anyone had dared to admit. And so, as he spoke of unity, as he promised that this was our moment, this was our time, a question hovered above it all like a storm cloud waiting to break. Could one man truly bridge a chasm 4 centuries wide? Backstage, as the applause began to fade and the Obamas prepared to leave the stage, a staffer handed him a folded note, something someone from the campaign had written earlier that day. It read simply, "History will judge us not by how we won, but by what we do next." He tucked it into his pocket, saying nothing. Outside, fireworks burst above Chicago's skyline, painting the night in crimson and gold. But he knew that dawn was coming, and with it, the impossible weight of expectation, because the truth of that night was not just triumph, it was the awakening of a new struggle. Hope had been elected, but hope alone could not govern. The same voices that had lifted him up would soon demand miracles. The economy was collapsing faster than anyone had imagined. Banks were failing, jobs disappearing, homes foreclosed. The honeymoon would be short, the grace shorter still. And yet, somehow there was still that feeling, quiet but unbroken, that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. As the night waned and the crowds dispersed, leaving Grant Park littered with flags and confetti, the city exhaled. A janitor sweeping the grounds paused for a moment, looking out over the empty field where history had unfolded. He smiled to himself and said softly, "We did it." But somewhere else, in a distant office lit by the cold glow of computer screens, another man was watching, expression unreadable. His advisors stood behind him in silence. "So it begins," he murmured. The camera lights flickered off, leaving only the quiet hum of machinery. Outside, the winds of a new era howled, because history, as it always does, was already writing its next chapter. And as Barack Obama's motorcade rolled through the sleeping city, the streets glistening beneath the streetlights, the question lingered in the air like smoke. What happens when the dreamer becomes the leader? The answer would come soon enough. But not tonight. Tonight, America dreamed. Morning came cold and gray over Washington, D.C. The city hushed beneath a thin veil of mist. The elation of victory had barely faded when the weight of governance came crashing down. From the windows of the White House, his new home, Barack Obama looked out over the still quiet Capitol, the marble monuments gleaming faintly in the dawn. It was beautiful, yes, but it felt haunted. Beneath that symmetry and grandeur lay decades of secrets, grudges, and power, restless forces that no election could silence. The echoes of celebration had barely died before the whispers began. In the corridors of Congress, in private boardrooms, in the echoing marble halls of K Street, the question was not whether he had won, but how long he could last. Change, they said, was inspiring rhetoric, but in practice it was dangerous. A few even muttered the word naive, as if hope were a weakness that would soon be punished by reality. The economy was burning. Banks trembled on the brink of collapse. In towns across America, the hum of factories went silent, replaced by foreclosure notices nailed to doors. Men who had worked 30 years in steel and auto plants now stood in unemployment lines stretching around corners. Entire neighborhoods emptied overnight. It wasn't just a financial crisis, it was a reckoning. And now, the man who had promised renewal was staring into the heart of an empire that was breaking down. Obama's first war council did not happen on a battlefield, but in a sterile conference room buried deep beneath the White House. Advisors circled around a table cluttered with charts and coffee cups. Every line on every graph pointed downward. The Secretary of the Treasury spoke rapidly, his tone a mix of panic and precision. If the system fails, it won't be Wall Street alone. We're talking grocery stores, hospitals, everything. The room smelled faintly of stale air and tension. Obama sat quietly, his hands clasped, absorbing every word. His campaign had been poetry. This, he realized, would be survival. Then we do what we must, he said finally, even if it's unpopular. The word bailout hung in the air like poison. The same people who had cheered him for promising change now watched in disbelief as billions flowed into the hands of banks that had helped cause the collapse. Protesters filled the streets. "Where's the hope now?" one sign read, scrawled in red paint. But the truth was brutal. Without intervention, the entire world economy might shatter. Obama knew it, and yet each decision pulled him deeper into a web of power and compromise. To save the kingdom, he had to feed the dragons that nearly destroyed it. It was here in those early months that the first cracks began to show, not just in the system, but in the spirit of the nation itself. The unity that had electrified his campaign began to unravel under the strain of survival. The same crowds that once chanted, "Yes, we can," began to murmur doubt. The honeymoon was over. The reckoning had begun. Behind the scenes, alliances were being forged in smoke-filled rooms. Senators who smiled for the cameras plotted in whispers. Lobbyists, sensing the vulnerability of a new leader, moved quickly to reclaim lost ground. For every promise of reform, there was an amendment buried in legal jargon to water it down. And in the shadows of the digital age, a new kind of warfare was stirring, one waged not with weapons, but with misinformation. The rise of social media, once seen as the voice of the people, began to mutate into a weaponized storm. Lies spread faster than truth, fear faster than hope. Each rumor, each doctored image, each thread of discontent added fuel to a fire few yet understood. Meanwhile, beyond America's borders, other players were watching. Russia, quiet but calculating, saw the distraction and began to test the edges of global order. China, patient and disciplined, tightened its grip on influence. The Middle East smoldered, Afghanistan bled, and in Iraq the ghosts of war refused to sleep. The empire Obama inherited was fractured, its alliances strained. And then came the Nobel Peace Prize. The announcement was met with shock, even among his own aides. For what? One whispered in disbelief. He hadn't even been in office a year. But the world had crowned him a symbol of possibility, even as his own nation questioned his strength. The irony was sharp. Praise from abroad, pressure at home. When he stepped to the podium in Oslo to accept it, the applause was thunderous. Yet his words carried the quiet weariness of a man who already understood that peace is not purity. It is burden. "I face the world as it is," he said, his voice steady, "and cannot stand idle in the face of threats." The audience listened in silence. The idealist had not died. He had simply been forced to share a throne with the realist. But the more he tried to bridge the two worlds, the moral and the political, the more they pulled apart. By 2010, Washington had become a battlefield. The healthcare war began not with rifles but with rhetoric sharp enough to wound. The Affordable Care Act, the dream of accessible healthcare for millions, became a crucible of fury. Town halls erupted into shouting matches. Protesters waved signs calling him a tyrant, a socialist, even worse. Inside the Oval Office, the toll was visible. His hair, once dark and youthful, began to turn gray at the temples. The days blurred into nights filled with reports, negotiations, and the relentless weight of decision-making. "Why do they hate it so much?" one advisor asked after another televised outburst. "Because it forces them to see each other," Obama said quietly. "And that's the hardest thing to do in this country." It was a moment of rare honesty, an acknowledgement that beneath the policies the true conflict was identity. America was not simply debating law, it was confronting itself. In the South, resentment stirred like old embers fanned back to life. In northern cities, hope dimmed beneath unemployment lines and debt. Conspiracy theories bled into mainstream talk. Late-night radio hosts called him a usurper. The movement that would later call itself the Tea Party was rising, fierce and organized, wrapping its anger in flags and slogans. But even as the noise rose, there were nights when the White House fell silent, when the city outside slept, and only the hum of the air conditioning broke the stillness. In those hours, Obama would sometimes walk the halls alone. He'd pause beneath the portraits of Lincoln and Kennedy, feeling their eyes on him. Men who had carried their own burdens of war and hope. Men who had also been betrayed by their times. He wondered what they would have done, whether they would have found a way to bring a fractured nation together again, or whether division was the true legacy of democracy. The storm reached its height in 2011. The Arab Spring erupted across the Middle East, an unexpected surge of rebellion and hope. From Cairo to Tripoli, young people flooded the streets demanding freedom. For a moment, it looked as if Obama's own message had gone global. But revolutions, like fire, rarely burn clean. The promise of democracy soon twisted into chaos. Libya descended into violence, Egypt into turmoil, and the world that had once seen Obama as a beacon of peace began to question whether America's influence brought liberation or ruin. And then one dark night in May, a decision came that would change everything. Deep within the Situation Room, the lights were dim, the air electric. A small team of advisors and generals watched the live feed flickering on screen. Grainy images from a compound in Pakistan. The hunt that had spanned a decade was about to end. Geronimo, EKIA, came the code over the radio. Enemy killed in action. Osama bin Laden was dead. The room erupted in quiet disbelief, then applause. Obama sat still, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of 10 years of fear, war, and vengeance hung heavy in the air. When he finally stood to address the nation that night, the streets filled once again, just as they had in 2008. Crowds gathered outside the White House chanting his name. American flags waved under the moonlight. But this time the celebration was darker, more primal, a victory born not of hope but of catharsis. He had delivered justice but not peace. And as the cheers echoed into the night, somewhere deep within him, he felt it. The shift. The line between idealism and necessity had been crossed. For every soul who rejoiced, there were others who questioned what it meant to celebrate death, even the death of an enemy. Was this the culmination of hope, or its corruption? He did not have an answer. All he knew was that history had turned again, and the man who once promised a new dawn now stood at the edge of something far more complicated, a world where victory could feel indistinguishable from loss. Outside, the crowd sang the national anthem, voices trembling with pride and exhaustion. But inside, as the lights dimmed and the screens went dark, Barack Obama looked out the window toward the quiet city and saw only the flickering of distant fires, wars not yet ended, divisions not yet healed. And as the night deepened, somewhere far beyond the Capitol, the first winds of backlash began to stir. What had once been unity was hardening into resistance. The movement that would soon rise against him was already being born in the ashes of his greatest triumph. The age of hope had given way to the age of reckoning. Rain lashed against the windows of the Oval Office, thin streaks of silver tracing paths down the glass. It was late, past midnight, and the corridors of the West Wing lay deserted, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic tap of rain against the old panes. Barack Obama stood alone, a pen motionless in his hand, a document open before him. The words on the page blurred together: policy, defense, appropriations. But behind them loomed something deeper, the creeping sense that his dream was slipping away. Power, he had learned, did not roar. It whispered, it seduced, it wrapped itself around ideals until even the purest intentions began to suffocate. Outside, thunder rumbled over Washington. Inside, the silence felt heavier than any storm. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, memories returned. Not of the campaign trail or the cheers of Grant Park, but of faces. The families who had handed him their trust, their belief that hope could change the machinery of government. The father who'd lost his job and told him, "Don't forget about us." The young soldier's mother who'd asked, "When will they come home?" He remembered their eyes, full of belief. And now, he feared, full of disappointment. The wars dragged on, the economy sputtered and clawed its way back from the brink. But the wounds ran deeper than numbers. Every compromise carved away a little of what he once stood for. And beyond the walls of power, a storm was gathering, louder, darker, more personal. It came first in voices, angry, insistent, feeding on fear. Talk radio, cable news, online forums that seethed with bitterness. "He's not one of us," they said. "He's destroying America." Lies spread like wildfire, and each repetition made them feel truer. The opposition had found its rallying cry, not just against his policies, but against his very identity. Obama's rise had once symbolized unity. Now it became a dividing line. At rallies across the country, the Tea Party movement surged like a tide of resentment. Homemade signs waved beneath storm-gray skies. "No more taxes. Take our country back." The chant was primal, echoing through small towns and open fields, through fear and nostalgia. The cameras captured the fury, but they missed the fear behind it. The feeling that the world was changing too fast, that something familiar was being erased. Obama understood that fear. He had studied it, walked among it. But understanding it did not shield him from its venom. Inside the White House, the staff began to fracture under the strain. Advisors argued over direction, strategy, legacy. "We can't lead with caution," one insisted. "We can't lead without it," said another. The tension grew like a hairline crack in glass, widening imperceptibly until it threatened to shatter the whole. Through it all, Obama maintained his composure. To the public, he remained cool, unshaken, the man of reason in an age of rage. But behind closed doors, the toll became visible. He smoked more, slept less. His humor grew dry, edged with weariness. At night, when the city slept, he would sometimes walk to the Truman balcony overlooking the South Lawn. The air there was quiet, heavy with the scent of wet grass and magnolia. He'd look out toward the Washington Monument piercing the dark sky, and beyond it the Capitol dome faintly aglow. He'd think of Lincoln, how he too had walked these same grounds under storm clouds of division. He wondered if Lincoln had ever felt this kind of solitude, the ache of trying to hold together a nation that seemed determined to pull itself apart. Then came the betrayal. Not the kind of betrayal marked by knives or scandals, but the slower, more intimate kind, the loss of faith. Allies began to drift away. Those who had once championed him grew distant, critical, calculating. The press that once adored him now picked apart every hesitation, every misstep. Progressives accused him of not being bold enough. Conservatives accused him of tyranny. And somewhere in the middle, the man himself began to wonder who he was serving anymore, the people or the machinery that governed them. The 2010 midterms hit like a hammer. The Democrats lost the House. The air in the White House turned heavy. the silence between meetings palpable. Hope, the word that had carried him to victory, was now a punchline on late-night television. That night, after the results came in, Obama stayed up long after the lights in the residence had dimmed. He sat at the edge of his desk, a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. "Maybe we were too early," he said softly, to no one in particular. But even as he doubted, the world refused to wait. Beyond America's borders, chaos spread like ink in water. Syria began to crumble into rebellion and blood. Russia tested its reach, and somewhere in the digital ether, a new kind of power was rising. Faceless, borderless, invisible. Cyber warfare, disinformation. The tools of control were evolving faster than anyone could legislate. The ground beneath history's feet was shifting. And then, amid the noise and the weight, a moment of light pierced through. May 2011. A quiet morning in a high school gym in Memphis. Obama was delivering a commencement address to a class of students who had achieved what few thought possible: reviving a failing school. The applause was genuine, the air thick with hope. And for the first time in months, he saw it again: the spark, the belief that change was still possible. As he spoke, his tone softened. "Every day," he told them, "you write the story of this nation. Not with grand speeches, but with your courage to keep moving forward no matter how hard it gets." When he stepped off the stage, one of the students, a young girl with trembling hands, pressed a note into his palm. Later in the motorcade, he unfolded it. In uneven handwriting, it read, "You made me believe that I could matter." For a long time, he stared at those words, the motorcade humming softly around him. He felt something shift, small, but undeniable. Perhaps hope was not a victory to be won once, but a fire to be tended, even as storms threatened to drown it. But hope was fragile, and history had no mercy. By his second term, the lines of battle were redrawn. Washington was gridlocked. Every decision, no matter how small, became a war. And in the shadows, something darker began to stir, a movement that would reshape everything that followed. It began as a whisper online, a current of anger and nationalism, a longing for the old order. Obama could feel it, like a pulse beneath the surface. The country he had tried to heal was splitting wider apart. Then came the revelation, the one that struck not with violence but with silence. In 2013, standing before the cameras in the White House briefing room, he faced the nation as Edward Snowden's leaks began to surface. The truth was explosive. The NSA, under his administration, had built an empire of surveillance, collecting data on millions of citizens. The architect of transparency was now painted as the overseer of intrusion. The irony cut deep. He had inherited the machinery of the war on terror and tried to wield it responsibly. But power, once seized, rarely releases its grip. The tools meant for safety had become instruments of control. "I never wanted this," he told an aide one evening, voice low, eyes shadowed. "But I can't unbuild what fear built." It was then, perhaps, that the illusion began to fracture completely. The people who had once seen him as the embodiment of hope now saw him as part of the same system he had vowed to reform. And yet he pressed on. He signed the Affordable Care Act into law. He rescued the auto industry. He ended the official combat mission in Iraq. Each achievement came at a cost: political, personal, moral. But even as his approval ratings faltered, he refused to retreat into bitterness. Still, the whispers grew louder. Not just against him, but against the very idea of progress. One night during a late briefing in the Situation Room, a junior staffer accidentally left a television on in the background. The sound of a political rally filled the room. Anger, chants, slogans. Obama listened for a moment, his expression unreadable. "They're not shouting at me," he said finally. "They're shouting at the idea of me." The room fell silent. Outside, lightning flashed over the Potomac, illuminating the black river below. He turned toward the window, his reflection fragmented by raindrops, and said quietly, "We changed history once, but history changes back." The words hung in the air like prophecy, because even as he spoke, the tide was turning. The forces that had long waited in the shadows, resentment, disinformation, disillusionment, were converging into something formidable. The very movement that had risen to dismantle him was now preparing to redefine America itself, and when that storm finally broke, it would sweep away more than one man's legacy. It would shake the foundations of democracy, truth, and identity. But for now, the city slept, unaware. The rain eased. The lights of Washington shimmered against the wet pavement like fractured stars. And in the quiet heart of power, Barack Obama stood alone, staring into the darkness that had once been filled with light. As the faint tremor of a new age began to rumble beneath his feet, the city no longer slept. By the time the second term settled into its rhythm, Washington pulsed with a strange unease, like the air before lightning strikes. The monuments that had once gleamed like marble promises now seemed watchful, their shadows stretching long and accusatory. The chants from the streets below rose like an ancient chorus, some of praise, others of defiance. In the early hours before dawn, Barack Obama sat once more in the Oval Office, the room cloaked in the dim amber of a single desk lamp. Before him, the daily intelligence briefing lay open, pages filled with coded names, conflicts, and whispered threats. The wars abroad had faded from the headlines, but they had not ended. They had merely gone underground, morphing into the shadows of drone strikes and digital warfare. Somewhere in a desert half a world away, a missile waited for his order. The pen in his hand felt heavier than any sword. He signed. Somewhere, unseen, an explosion bloomed, its flash invisible, its sound never to be heard by those who gave the command. He set the pen down, staring at his reflection in the window. The man who had once promised peace now lived in a world ruled by screens and ghosts. Victory and violence had become indistinguishable, and the moral arithmetic of war blurred until even righteousness had no clear shape. Peace, he whispered, is just a quieter kind of war. Behind him, the grandfather clock ticked relentlessly. Each second sounded like history counting down. Outside, America had begun to fracture, not visibly but spiritually. The faith that once bound its people had frayed into 1,000 strands of anger. Every tragedy, every protest, every policy sparked an inferno of accusation. Black Lives Matter marches filled the streets. Police lines met them in smoke and shields. Ferguson, Baltimore, Baton Rouge. Names of cities became symbols of wounds that had never truly healed. One night, watching live footage of another protest burning under the glare of news cameras, Obama murmured to his aide, "This is the storm we thought we'd escaped." It was not lost on him that the hope which had lifted him to power was now turning against him, demanding justice faster than any system could deliver it. The same eyes that once looked to him as savior now saw in him the slow machinery of compromise. The roar of anger was met with the silence of institutions too paralyzed to move. And then came the moment that broke the illusion of distance. Charleston. A church. 9 lives taken by a white supremacist's gun. The news spread through the White House like a cold wind. Obama stood by the window when he heard, his hand pressed against the glass, his jaw set. The rage that rippled through the nation was raw, unfiltered. At the memorial, he stood before the caskets lined in solemn rows. The air inside the church was heavy with grief. He paused, the silence stretching long enough to hurt, and then began to sing, softly, unexpectedly, Amazing Grace. For a brief, trembling moment, the storm quieted. The crowd rose in unison, voices blending with his. The melody swelled through the rafters, a lament and a prayer all at once. But grace, as he knew, was fleeting, because outside, the world was changing faster than grace could reach. The rise of social media had unleashed a new chaos. Truth itself was burning, consumed in the wildfire of algorithms. Every tweet, every post, every lie multiplied faster than any truth could catch it. Nations fought not with armies, but with pixels and propaganda. Enemies no longer wore uniforms, they wore faces on screens. And in this new battlefield, Russia saw its opportunity. The year was 2014 when the first whispers of interference began. Crimea was annexed. Eastern Ukraine ignited. The old Cold War lines flickered back to life, drawn this time not across borders, but through the hearts of voters and the veins of the internet. Obama watched as the storm spread across continents, quiet, strategic, relentless. Sanctions were imposed, warnings issued, alliances strained. But deep down, he knew the rules of the old world were crumbling. America was no longer fighting for dominance, it was fighting for definition. In private meetings, intelligence officials spoke in grim tones. "They're not invading territory," one said. "They're invading truth." And truth, Obama knew, was a nation's most fragile fortress. At home, the 2016 election loomed like a thunderhead on the horizon. The Democratic candidate he supported carried the promise of continuity, but also the baggage of decades in the political arena. His opponents painted her as the face of corruption. The right-wing insurgency he had once dismissed as fringe had grown into an army of populists, fueled by grievance and amplified by digital fire. Obama could feel it, the shift in the wind, the turning of the tide. The rallies grew larger, louder, darker. Chants of "lock her up" echoed through the night. Walls and borders became the new rallying cries. The America he had spent 8 years trying to mend was dividing faster than ever. In the quiet of his study one evening, he turned to Michelle and said, "We tried to build a bridge, but maybe they were never ready to cross." She looked at him, eyes steady but sad. "Bridges don't fail because of who builds them," she said. "They fail because of who burns them." He smiled faintly, but the truth of her words lingered long after she left the room. Then came the storm. The election night of 2016 was eerily familiar and yet utterly different from that of 2008. The same maps, the same glowing screens, but this time the colors bled red instead of blue. One by one, the states fell, not to hope, but to anger. The cheers that had once shaken Grant Park were now replaced by gasps of disbelief in hotel ballrooms across the nation. Obama watched from the residence, his face unreadable, the flicker of the television reflecting in his eyes. "So this," he whispered, "is how history turns." He knew, even before the results were final, that this was more than a political defeat. It was a reckoning. A repudiation of his legacy, his ideals, his belief in reason itself. In the days that followed, the streets filled again, this time not with celebration but protest. The nation was split clean down the middle. Hope had given way to hostility. The baton of power would soon pass to hands that seemed intent on unmaking everything he had built. In the West Wing, packing boxes began to appear. The hallways that once rang with staffers' laughter now echoed with the muted sounds of departure. On his last night in the Oval Office, Obama lingered long after everyone else had gone. The room felt smaller somehow, as if history itself were holding its breath. He reached into his pocket and unfolded an old creased note, the same one given to him years ago during his campaign. "History will judge us not by how we won, but by what we do next." He read it once, then set it down on the desk, beside the letter he had written to his successor. "America," he murmured, "you are still my unfinished story." But outside, a new wind was rising. Across the country, the machinery of misinformation roared to life. Conspiracy theories became scripture. The truth, already weakened, began to collapse entirely under the weight of rage and tribalism. The old institutions, media, justice, democracy itself, quivered as if under siege. From his post-presidency office, Obama watched it unfold with the quiet of a man who had seen too much history to be surprised. Interviews, speeches, pleas for reason, none of it stemmed the tide. He began to realize that the legacy of his presidency was not a conclusion, but a prelude, and beneath it all something darker moved, a gathering shadow stretching across the Western world. Populism, nationalism, the ghosts of the past reborn in modern tongues. The same flames that had once consumed empires now flickered at democracy's edge. There were nights when he could not sleep. He'd stand on the balcony of his home, looking out over the quiet city he once ruled. The wind would carry distant echoes, protests, sirens, the restless hum of an age in turmoil. Sometimes he'd whisper into the dark, "Was it worth it?" The wind never answered. Yet somewhere deep down he knew this was not the end of the story. Every age of progress births its shadow. Every hope invites resistance. And every storm, no matter how violent, begins with the smallest change in the air. In the distance, thunder rolled over the Potomac, a low, continuous growl that seemed to shake the night itself. The papers on his desk rustled. A framed photograph, him and his family on that bright November night in 2008, tilted slightly in the vibration. The past and present seemed to blur for a heartbeat. The storm was here, not of rain or war, but of truth itself. And as lightning flashed over the Capitol dome, Barack Obama stood still, his reflection caught in the glass like a ghost between two worlds. The man who once embodied America's promise, now watching as that promise teetered on the edge of undoing. The next chapter of history was coming, swift, merciless, unstoppable. And all across the nation, as if sensing it in their bones, millions of people looked up from their screens, their conversations, their fears, and felt it too. The world was about to change again, and history was holding its breath. It began with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes before collapse. In that fragile quiet between one presidency and the next, the United States stood on the edge of something unseen. The old guard had fallen. The new one swaggered in, loud and unapologetic, promising to undo the past 8 years with the stroke of a pen. On the steps of the Capitol, Barack Obama watched as his successor raised a hand to swear the oath. The crowd roared, divided between cheers and jeers. Behind the smiles and ceremonial music, history trembled. It was not the peaceful transfer of power that filled the air, it was reckoning. For the first time, the nation felt like a battlefield where no side could claim victory. As the new era dawned, truths long buried began to surface. Memos, investigations, whispers, all threads of a hidden war that had been fought not with armies, but with code, leaks, and lies. The Russian interference, once dismissed as rumor, began to take shape in official reports. It was no longer just politics, it was infiltration. The sanctity of democracy had been pierced from within. Obama read the intelligence briefings in disbelief long after leaving office. He had known interference existed, but not its depth, not its reach. Social networks had become weapons. Truth had become currency. Every division that split the American people had been widened by invisible hands across oceans. He stared at the data, the false posts, the manipulated videos. It wasn't war in the old sense. No bullets, no blood. But it was more dangerous. Because this war rewrote the mind. History will never be the same, he whispered. Not because it changed, but because no one will know what's true. The realization cut deeper than any defeat. Democracy had always depended on shared reality, on people agreeing that the sky was blue, that votes were counted, that truth was still truth. But now, that foundation cracked beneath digital storms. And as America splintered, the world followed. Across Europe, the same populist flames rose, borders hardened, truth grew fragile. Nationalism, once thought buried with the 20th century, returned like a ghost demanding vengeance. It was as though the 21st century had turned against its own creation, freedom itself. Obama's legacy, once seen as light, now flickered in uncertainty. The Affordable Care Act, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, all targeted, all dismantled. Hope, once his greatest weapon, became his greatest wound. He could feel the weight of history pressing against him. The same crowds that once sang, "Yes, we can," now echoed with doubt. Was change ever real? Or had it only been a dream too fragile for the world that came after? The years passed. The chaos deepened. Charlottesville, the travel bans, the cages at the border, tweets replacing diplomacy, lies replacing law. Each moment, each headline felt like a new fracture in the idea of America itself. And then, January 6th, 2021. It began like a scene from another time, something unthinkable, almost mythic. The Capitol, symbol of democracy, under siege. Crowds swarming the steps, flags waving, glass shattering, policemen overrun, lawmakers fleeing. On television screens across the world, the storming of the Capitol played like the fall of Rome in real time. Obama watched from his home, eyes fixed on the screen, his face hollow with disbelief. This is what happens, he murmured, when truth dies. For years he had warned of division, of what happens when leaders feed fear instead of unity. But now the prophecy stood before him, flesh and fire. The very building where he once took his oath was desecrated by citizens who believed the election had been stolen. The great American myth that democracy was unbreakable, shattered in a single afternoon. And yet, something within that chaos stirred a deeper revelation. Even as the rioters raged, others stood in defiance. Police officers held their ground. Lawmakers returned that night to certify the vote, refusing to let terror dictate history. It was fragile, but it was still standing. America, wounded, furious, fractured, was still alive. In the aftermath, Obama found himself reflecting on the paradox of his legacy. The story had always been painted as light versus darkness, but history, he now understood, was never that simple. Every triumph carried its shadow. Every reform sowed resistance. He thought of Lincoln, whose victory birthed rebellion. Of Roosevelt, whose New Deal forged enemies in the powerful. Of Martin Luther King Jr., whose dream ignited violence before it inspired peace. Progress, he realized, was not a straight line. It was a storm, constant, cyclical, merciless. And now, he was merely one voice echoing through that storm. In his post-presidency speeches, his words changed. They grew quieter, less triumphant, more reflective. Democracy, he said in one address, is not a monument. It's a motion, and when it stops moving, it dies. The audience listened in silence. Some nodded, others turned away. He no longer sought applause. He sought understanding, because the revelation was clear now. History's greatest lie is that it moves forward. In truth, it circles, again and again, testing humanity's will to rise from its own ashes. Years later, walking along the Lincoln Memorial at dusk, Obama paused to watch the reflection of the monument ripple across the water. The same place where he had once spoken of hope now felt like a mirror for everything he had lost and gained. He closed his eyes. The air smelled of rain. He thought of that first night in 2008, the cheers, the tears, the flood of belief. He remembered the faces in the crowd, glowing like stars in the cold. Every one of them believing that history had finally bent toward justice. But history, he now knew, never bends easily. Sometimes it breaks first. He opened his eyes. Across the water, the Washington Monument pierced the storm clouds, its tip catching the faintest glimmer of dying light. In that single reflection, of shadow and brightness, of ruin and resilience, he saw the truth of his story. Change was never about victory. It was about endurance. Hope was not the opposite of despair. It was its companion, the fragile light that refuses to die, even when surrounded by darkness. He walked on, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble. Behind him, the city hummed, restless, divided, but alive. Ahead, the night deepened, vast and uncertain. And somewhere between those two worlds, between what was and what could still be, the storm finally began to quiet. Not because it ended, but because history at last had exhaled. The rain had long stopped by the time dawn touched the reflecting pool. A pale light shimmered on the surface, breaking softly against the stone steps where once, years ago, a crowd of thousands had gathered to listen to a promise. The city around it had changed, skylines taller, skies dimmer, but the echo of that voice still lingered in the air like something sacred. It was not the voice itself that mattered anymore, nor the words carved into history books and archived speeches. It was the feeling, the breath of a generation that had once dared to believe that yes, they could. And though the world had spun on, through chaos, division, pandemics, and revolutions of silicon and steel, that spark had not gone out. It flickered still, somewhere between the ruins of what was and the blueprints of what might still be. Years had passed since Barack Obama left the White House, but time had only deepened the mythology. To some, he was the great reformer who steadied a collapsing nation. To others, a symbol of promises unfulfilled. Yet to history itself, cold, patient, and eternal, he was something more elusive, a bridge between eras, between the fading world of 20th century certainty and the uncertain dawn of the 21st, between a country once defined by color and one struggling to define its conscience, between the dream and the reckoning. In the classrooms of the future, his story was no longer taught as mere politics, but as parable. Children read about a man who rose from obscurity to power, not by force of wealth or inheritance, but through the audacity of belief. Belief that words could heal, that hope could still move the marrow of nations. Holographic archives played his speeches as if they were psalms from an ancient text. "We are the ones we've been waiting for," he had said once, and centuries later, it sounded less like a slogan and more like a prophecy. And yet, like all prophecies, its meaning had changed with time. The United States, once an empire of influence and contradiction, had fractured and reformed many times since. Empires do not fall all at once. They fade in fragments, then return in echoes. But the image of that night in 2008, the sea of faces, the tears, the unbroken chant, survived every collapse. It became the memory that people reached for when the world felt too dark to navigate. In the archives of Mars Station 1, centuries later, explorers from a new world studied the era of Earth's Great Division. They read about the 44th president, a man born of two worlds, two continents, two legacies, and marveled at how his time marked the crossroads of human civilization. He believed in unity, one archivist whispered, scrolling through the hologram of his first inaugural address, even when the world was built to stay divided. Another nodded, eyes wide with the awe that only distance can bring. And did he succeed? The question hung in the air, as weightless and eternal as the stars outside their window. Back on Earth, the Washington Monument still stood, though its marble was weathered, its surface marked by centuries of acid rain and restoration. Pilgrims came from distant nations to stand where history had once bent, and to watch the dawn rise across the same horizon that Obama had once faced. They brought offerings, not flowers or flags, but words, letters etched onto thin plates of light, floating in the air above the reflecting pool. Messages that began with "Dear President," or sometimes simply, "Dear Hope." And as each shimmered into being, the light from the rising sun passed through them, scattering the words like constellations across the surface of the water. Some messages were simple. "Thank you for believing when we couldn't." Others were heavier. "We tried, but it wasn't enough." And a few, written in the trembling hand of survivors from a later age, whispered, "We still haven't found our better angels." Yet even these messages were part of the same truth, that hope, once unleashed, could never be fully extinguished. It lived on not in governments or monuments, but in the quiet persistence of people who refused to stop believing in tomorrow. That perhaps was Obama's truest legacy, not a policy nor a party, but a posture of the soul, a way of standing in the storm without bowing to it. In a quiet suburb of Honolulu, long after the world had moved on, an old house stood half covered in vines. Inside, on a weathered desk, lay a single-framed photograph, a family smiling beneath a night sky of fireworks. The picture had faded to sepia, the colors long surrendered to time. But if you looked closely, the joy was still there, uncorrupted, undimmed. Beside it, a leather-bound journal contained words in Obama's own hand. Not speeches, not drafts, reflections. Thoughts written in the solitude of his later years. One passage read, "Power never belonged to me. It never belonged to anyone. It only moves through us, and brief as breath, bright as a match in darkness. The question is not who holds it, but who dares to use it for light before it goes out. That line, historians later said, was the closest he ever came to defining his own faith. Not in institutions, but in endurance. Not in victory, but in the courage to try again. And that faith, fragile, imperfect, human, became the thread that tied his age to every age that followed. In the centuries that came, leaders rose and fell. Wars burned continents. Machines replaced cities. The line between flesh and code blurred until humanity questioned what it even meant to be alive. But through all of it, the words endured. Yes, we can. A phrase too simple for the complexity of history. And yet somehow it still fit. Because every generation needed to be reminded, not of what they had achieved, but of what they could still reach for. On a quiet evening, far into the future, a teacher stood before her students in a floating classroom above the ruins of old Chicago. The water below shimmered with the reflections of glass towers rebuilt over what was once Grant Park. She told them of a night when millions gathered to celebrate not a victory, but a possibility. Her voice softened as she described how the people of that age, broken and divided, had dared to imagine themselves whole. "Did he change the world?" one of them asked. The teacher smiled faintly, her gaze distant. He reminded it that change was possible. Outside, lightning flickered across the clouds, brief, silent, beautiful. The teacher watched it fade, then whispered almost to herself, "Every age has its storm, but some storms are born of hope." And somewhere, deep within the archive of human memory, the sound of that night's chant, half song, half prayer, stirred once more. Yes, we can. Yes, we did. Yes, we must again. The world turned. The sky dimmed. The stars came out one by one. In the long rhythm of history, of empires rising and falling, of names remembered and forgotten, the legacy of one man folded back into the endless fabric of humanity's striving, not as a monument but as a reminder. That progress is never a place reached but a journey continued. That hope, however fragile, is still the most powerful rebellion against despair. And as the screen fades to black, two questions remain, echoing through the quiet. What if the true measure of greatness is not in how long one leads, but in how deeply one inspires others to rise? And what if every storm in history, no matter how dark, was only ever clearing the way for the next dawn?